My husband slammed his fork down so hard it rattled the plates and said, "Say sorry to my brother right now, or get out of my house." The table went silent. Everyone was watching me. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't the first time he chose his brother over me. It was just the first time he did it in front of witnesses. So I stood up, not to apologize. I walked over and did something that ended my marriage forever. Stick with me. My name is Hannah Cole. I'm in my early 30s, married, and tired in a way sleep never fixes. The dinner was at our house. I cooked all day. The table was full, family, small talk, fake smiles. I kept telling myself to get through it. Just one more dinner. Mark sat at the head of the table, relaxed, proud. His younger brother Evan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, that same easy grin he always wore. Evan had a way of saying things that sounded harmless but landed sharp. He did it slowly, like he wanted me to feel it. Halfway through dinner, Evan laughed and said, "Some people are just too sensitive. You can't joke around them without drama." His eyes flicked to me. A few people chuckled. My chest tightened. I took a breath. I spoke calmly. I said, "That's not a joke. It's not funny to put people down." My voice didn't shake. I was proud of that. Mark snapped. He didn't ask what I meant. He didn't tell Evan to stop. He turned to me, red-faced, and said I was embarrassing him. Then he gave me the choice. Say sorry to Evan. Or leave. The room felt smaller. I could hear my own heartbeat. I looked around and saw people avoiding my eyes. No one said a word. The shame burned, but something else rose up too. Clarity. This wasn't about a bad joke. This was about all the times I stayed quiet. All the times I let things slide so the night wouldn't be ruined. All the times Mark chose peace with his brother over respect for his wife. I stood up. My chair scraped the floor. Everyone thought I was heading for the door. Even Mark did. I didn't. I walked toward Evan. He was still smiling, sure he had won. I stopped right in front of him, met his eyes, and opened my mouth. And the room froze on what I was about to say. Evan had always been like this. Sitting there at the table, smiling like nothing could touch him. I felt years of memories press in all at once. He knew exactly how far he could go. He always did. To everyone else, Evan was charming. He told funny stories, helped clear plates, asked people about their jobs. He made eye contact. He laughed at the right moments. If you met him once, you'd think he was a great guy. That was the version Mark fell for every single time. But I knew the other version. The quiet comments said just low enough that only I could hear. The looks that lingered too long. The jokes that felt more like tests. If I reacted, he'd tilt his head and say, "Relax, I'm kidding." And somehow, I'd end up feeling embarrassed for even bringing it up. Mark had always protected him. Not loudly. Not obviously. Just enough. If I said Evan crossed a line, Mark would sigh and say, "You know how he is." If I said something felt wrong, Mark would say I was reading too much into it. Evan was his little brother. The one he helped raise. The one who needed him. Evan needed him in more ways than one. Mark never talked about it in front of people, but I knew. The small loans that were never paid back. The rent Mark covered, just for a few months. The car repairs. The excuses. Evan liked to act independent, but he leaned on Mark without shame. And Mark liked being needed. I remembered all the times I swallowed my feelings to keep things calm. The holidays I smiled through. The jokes I pretended not to hear. I told myself it was easier. I told myself it wasn't worth a fight. Each time, a small part of me went quiet. Around the table, I could feel the tension building, even though no one understood why. People shifted in their seats. Forks slowed. Conversations faded. They could sense something was wrong, but they didn't know the history. They didn't know how long this had been building. Evan glanced at Mark, then back at me. That smirk crept across his face. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel on the surface. It was confident. He knew Mark would step in. He always did. And as I stood there, facing him, I realized Evan wasn't fearless. He was protected. And for the first time, that protection was about to crack. Standing there, facing Evan, I felt an old memory rise up. The reason I stopped speaking up in the first place. The reason I learned how to stay quiet. Years ago, before this house, before these dinners, Evan crossed a line he should never have crossed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. That almost made it worse. It happened in a small moment, when no one else was around. A look that lasted too long. A touch that didn't feel like an accident. Words said softly, with a smile, like he was daring me to react. I remember freezing. I remember my body knowing something was wrong before my mind could explain it. I told Mark that night. I didn't accuse. I didn't yell. I just said it made me uncomfortable. I said I didn't feel safe around his brother anymore. Mark listened, but his face closed off. He rubbed his temples and said Evan would never mean it that way. He said his brother was careless, not cruel. He said I must have misunderstood. Then he said the words that stayed with me for years. If you make this a big deal, it's going to tear the family apart. So I shrank it. I softened my story. I started doubting myself. Maybe it wasn't that bad. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I imagined it. Mark repeated that enough times that I started believing him. After that, I learned how to survive. I stayed polite. I avoided being alone with Evan. I laughed at jokes that hurt. I chose silence because it felt safer than being blamed. Each time I ignored my instincts, they grew quieter. I didn't even realize how much I stopped trusting myself. I just knew I felt smaller. Less sure. Like I needed permission to feel what I felt. Now, at the dinner table, with everyone watching, that old wound tore open. Evan's smile. Mark's anger. The demand that I apologize. It was the same pattern, just louder. Same message. Keep the peace. Don't rock the boat. Accept discomfort so others can feel comfortable. My chest tightened, but this time I didn't look away. I could feel that younger version of myself inside me, the one who stayed quiet to survive. I understood why she did it, but I also knew something had changed. This dinner wasn't creating a new pain. It was reopening an old one. And for the first time, instead of pushing it down, I let myself feel it fully. Mark didn't calm down. He leaned into it. His voice got louder, sharper, like he wanted everyone to hear his side before I could speak again. He said I was overreacting. He said I always took things the wrong way. He laughed once, short and hard, and told the table I was being dramatic. I felt my face burn. Not because I was wrong, but because he said it so easily. Like he had practiced those words. Like he had used them before. He looked around the table and said, "She's just too sensitive sometimes. You all know how she is." A few people shifted in their seats. No one agreed with him, but no one challenged him either. Their silence felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on me. I looked at the walls of the house I helped make a home. The table I set. The food I cooked. And suddenly, I felt like a guest in my own life. Like I didn't belong in the space I stood in. Evan sighed and shook his head, playing his part perfectly. He said he didn't understand why I was upset. He said he was only joking. He even said he felt attacked. His voice was soft, wounded. If you didn't know him, you might feel sorry for him. Mark stepped closer to me. He repeated the choice. Apologize or leave. He said it wasn't that hard. Just say the words and we could move on. The message was clear. My comfort mattered less than keeping his brother happy. My truth mattered less than family peace. In that moment, I understood something I had been avoiding for years. Mark's loyalty came with rules. I could be loved, but only if I stayed quiet. I could belong, but only if I didn't challenge the people he protected. His support wasn't unconditional. It depended on my silence. The room felt small again. The air felt thin. I realized everyone was waiting for me to back down, to smooth it over like I always did. That was the role they expected me to play. But something inside me finally clicked into place. Love should never feel like a trap. It should never demand that you erase yourself to keep others comfortable. It should never ask you to apologize for being hurt. I stood there, heart pounding, and saw the truth clearly for the first time. If staying meant staying silent, then staying was no longer an option. And Mark, standing there with his ultimatum, had already made his choice. I didn't answer Mark. I didn't grab my coat. I didn't look for the door. Instead, I turned and took one step toward Evan. The room went silent. No plates moved. No one spoke. The only sound was my footsteps against the floor. Slow. Steady. Each step felt heavier than the last, but also clearer. Like I was walking toward something I had avoided for years. Everyone thought they knew what was coming. I could feel it. They thought I was giving in. They thought I was about to say sorry just to end the tension. That was the version of me they were used to. The one who smoothed things over. Evan leaned back in his chair, arms loose, already relaxed. He wore that same confident smile, like he'd already won. Mark watched me closely, waiting to see if I would obey. His face was tight, expectant. I stopped in front of Evan. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't shake. I just looked at him and said his name. Evan. He tilted his head, still smiling. Yeah. I leaned in slightly, close enough that only he could hear me clearly. "Do you remember the night in the hallway?" I said, calm and slow. "When you told me not to tell Mark because he'd never believe me anyway?" The smile left his face. It happened in an instant. His eyes flicked away. His jaw tightened. For the first time, he didn't have a joke ready. He didn't laugh. He didn't speak. The table noticed. Someone shifted in their chair. Someone else sucked in a breath. They didn't know what I meant, but they could see something had changed. Mark frowned. "What are you talking about?" he asked, looking from me to Evan. His voice had lost its edge. It was uncertain now. Evan swallowed. His confidence cracked just enough to show what was underneath. Fear. He straightened in his seat, hands gripping the edge of the table. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out wrong. "Hannah," Mark said again, sharper this time. "What are you doing?" I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on Evan. The power in the room had shifted, and Evan felt it. He knew I wasn't guessing. He knew I wasn't bluffing. I was standing on something real. Mark took a step toward us, his face changing as understanding began to form. Confusion turned into alarm. He could feel control slipping, and he didn't know why yet. I stayed calm. My heart was pounding, but my voice stayed steady. This walk across the room wasn't about an apology. It was about finally being heard. I straightened up and spoke so everyone could hear me. My voice didn't shake. I didn't raise it. I just told the truth, the way it actually happened. I said that years ago, Evan crossed a line with me when no one else was around. I explained it clearly, without details meant to shock. I said it made me uncomfortable and unsafe. I said I told Mark the same night. I didn't add feelings to it. I didn't add blame. I just laid out the facts. Then I said what happened next. I said Mark told me I misunderstood. I said he asked me not to make it a problem. I said he chose calm dinners and family peace over listening to his wife. The room stayed quiet as I spoke. No one interrupted me. I explained how Evan learned from that moment. How he started pushing small limits because he knew he was protected. How he made comments that sounded like jokes. How he waited until no one was listening. How he always made sure I looked like the difficult one if I reacted. People around the table started to shift. Faces changed. They weren't confused anymore. They were connecting the pieces. The tension they felt suddenly made sense. Evan laughed too quickly. He shook his head and said I was twisting things. He said I was remembering it wrong. He said I was holding on to something that never really happened. But his voice was uneven. He talked too fast. He looked at Mark more than he looked at me. Mark stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. His mouth opened, then closed. I could see the moments replaying in his head. The times I went quiet. The nights I avoided his brother. The fights he ended by telling me to let it go. Evan tried again, louder this time. He said I was lying. He said I wanted attention. But the words didn't land. They felt thin. Desperate. No one laughed. No one backed him up. Mark finally spoke, but it wasn't strong. He asked Evan why he never told him any of this. The question came too late. The damage was already there. His face drained of color as understanding settled in. I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. I had carried this alone for years, and now it was out in the open. Not as a dramatic story. Not as a fight. Just the truth. And the truth had weight. The table stayed silent as Mark realized something he couldn't undo. By choosing not to listen, he hadn't kept the peace. He had protected the wrong person. And now everyone could see it. Evan's face changed. The calm mask he always wore slipped, and what showed underneath was sharp and ugly. He pushed his chair back hard and stood up. His voice rose, loud and angry, nothing like the joking tone from before. "This is insane," he snapped. "She's been holding this against me for years. She always does this." He pointed at me like I was the problem. The anger in his voice wasn't careful anymore. It spilled out fast, reckless. He said I was trying to ruin his relationship with his brother. He said I was jealous. He said I liked causing trouble. Each word came out harsher than the last. People around the table flinched. This wasn't the charming Evan they knew. Mark stepped in quickly. "That's enough," he said, holding up a hand, but not at Evan. At me. He turned toward me and told me to stop. He said this wasn't the time. He said we could talk about it later, in private like always. I shook my head. "No," I said. My voice was steady. That surprised even me. "I've talked in private. It didn't change anything." Mark looked stunned. He opened his mouth to cut me off again, but I kept going. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't rush. I simply refused to be quiet. Evan laughed bitterly and said something cruel about how no one would believe me anyway. Then he said it, the thing he never should have said. He said, "You should have known better than to make a big deal out of it. Mark never took you seriously." The room went dead silent. Mark turned slowly toward his brother. His face tightened. Evan froze, realizing too late what he'd revealed. The truth hung in the air, clear and heavy. Something shifted in that moment. The power Evan always leaned on disappeared. Mark's authority cracked too. This house, this table, this space where they controlled the story, it no longer belonged to them. I felt it in my chest. Not fear. Not shame. Clarity. I could see everything clearly now. How often I was interrupted. How easily my voice was dismissed. How silence had been demanded of me for their comfort. Mark looked lost, like he didn't recognize the situation anymore. Evan looked cornered, angry and exposed. And for the first time, I wasn't the smallest person in the room. I stood there, calm and grounded, knowing something important had changed. I wasn't fighting anymore. I was done being silenced. I took a slow breath and looked around the room one last time. Everyone was watching me now, not with judgment, but with uncertainty. They were waiting to see what I would do next. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. "I'm leaving," I said. My voice was calm. "But not because you told me to." Mark stepped forward quickly. His tone softened, like he was switching masks. He said my name quietly and asked me to wait. He said we could talk in the other room. He said he didn't mean what he said earlier. He reached for my arm, gentle now, careful. I stepped back. I told him I wasn't losing my home tonight. I told him he was losing his wife. The words landed heavy, and the room felt smaller again. Mark's face crumpled for a moment. He lowered his voice and begged me not to do this in front of everyone. He promised things would change. He promised he would handle Evan. I had heard those promises before. Always after the damage was done. When I didn't move, his tone changed again. Frustration replaced fear. He said I was overreacting. He said I was destroying our marriage over something small. The switch was so fast it almost made me tired instead of angry. And that's when I recognized it clearly. The pattern. Kind words when he was scared. Anger when control didn't return. It had never been about understanding me. It had always been about keeping things the same. I shook my head and told him I wasn't apologizing. Not tonight. Not ever again. Silence fell again, but this time it felt different. Final. One by one, the guests stood up. No one made eye contact. They murmured excuses and picked up coats. They left quietly, like they didn't want to disturb the truth that had just come out. The house emptied fast. Evan stayed seated. He looked smaller now. Without Mark defending him, without the crowd, he didn't know what to do. The confidence was gone. What remained was someone used to being protected, suddenly exposed. Mark stood in the middle of the room, torn between anger and panic. He didn't know which one would work anymore. I grabbed my bag and walked toward the door. My hands didn't shake. My chest felt light. This wasn't an escape. I wasn't running away. I was walking out with my dignity. And I knew deep down I wouldn't be walking back. The moment I closed the door behind me, I felt the weight of what had changed. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was the start of consequences that neither Mark nor Evan had imagined. Mark finally understood, too late, that I wasn't just leaving a fight at the table. I had control in ways he had ignored for years. He had relied on my silence to keep everything smooth. He had thought I would bend, apologize, and settle. But now, with me gone, he realized the power I held in the home, in the life we built together, in the decisions he never considered I could influence. And it wasn't about money. It wasn't about drama. It was about control and respect, and suddenly that had shifted. The financial consequences appeared almost immediately. I called my attorney quietly, made sure accounts were separate, and confirmed what I had always known. I had every right to leave with my share of our life together. Mark's face drained when he realized the small safety nets he assumed were his control were actually mine. Everything he thought he owned or directed, I had a say in. And now I was exercising it. Evan, who had always leaned on Mark like a shield, suddenly looked vulnerable. Without Mark defending him blindly, he struggled. Every favor, every excuse he had relied on became fragile. I could see it in the way he hesitated, uncertain for the first time. His dependence on my husband had become his weakness. I calmly outlined what would happen next. I wasn't yelling. I didn't threaten. I just stated the facts. What Mark needed to do to handle finances, what Evan had to accept about boundaries, what I would take with me, and what I wouldn't. It was precise, clear, and quiet. I left no room for misinterpretation. Revenge isn't always loud. It's deliberate, measured, and certain. I took my dignity with me, not as a trophy, but as a shield. I had spent years shrinking myself, hiding my voice, and absorbing their mistakes. Now, I walked away with my truth intact. Mark was left with guilt, denial, and regret. He could replay every argument, every excuse, every dismissal, and he would see the pattern too late. Evan couldn't charm his way out. The family he had leaned on had shifted. And I was free. No yelling. No dramatic declarations. Just consequences. Immediate, real, and unshakable. And for the first time in years, I felt completely in control of my life. Life after that night was quieter than I expected. No shouting, no fights, no chaos. Just space. Space to breathe, to think, and to rebuild the life I had been hiding in for years. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I took each day slowly, focusing on what mattered to me, not what anyone else wanted me to do. Mark reached out. A text, a call, even a knock at my door. He said he wanted to talk. He said he missed me. He said he wanted to fix things. But I didn't answer right away. I thought about the years I had spent silencing myself, the moments I had given up my voice, the pain I had swallowed to keep him comfortable. Too much had passed. Too much had been revealed. It was too late. Evan disappeared from my world naturally. No one mentioned him. No one tried to defend him. Without Mark protecting him, his influence faded. He became irrelevant in the story of my life. Just a small figure in the background I no longer needed to notice. The relief was subtle but deep. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. I spent time reflecting on what had happened, not to dwell on the hurt, but to understand my own strength. I didn't romanticize the pain. I didn't glorify the nights I cried alone or the moments I doubted myself. I simply acknowledged them. They were real, but they didn't define me. What defined me was how I acted after, how I took back control over my life and my choices. I realized something important. Self-respect was more valuable than comfort. I didn't need to forgive anyone to feel whole. I didn't need closure from Mark or Evan. I didn't need their approval. I just needed to live my life on my terms. And so I did. I rebuilt my routines, my home, my friendships. I laughed more freely. I spoke more openly. I made choices without fear of judgment or interference. The quiet revenge I carried wasn't loud or vengeful. It was simply living fully and confidently without them in the center of my world. The real revenge was not an argument, not a confrontation, not an announcement. It was never explaining myself again. It was choosing peace instead of proof, dignity instead of drama. And in that quiet, steady life I created for myself, I found something better than triumph. I found peace. If you've ever felt silenced or dismissed in your relationships, take a moment to reflect on your boundaries and self-respect. Standing up calmly for yourself can change the power dynamics without drama. Learn to assert your voice, protect your dignity, and prioritize emotional well-being over comfort or approval.